inventing troubles deaths. And suddenly there's a protest outside the university of people holding up photos of people who really lost their lives in the troubles with real written along it. And they're saying that you're mocking what our loss by doing this and holding it up as important. And that gave me a really interesting space in that story to think about what role fiction has when it comes to dealing with real historical material, and particularly historical material that's related to traumatic, difficult periods of time. I got asked in Germany in January by a very clever student what my relationship to historical material was as a writer of fiction. And this is what has come from that. Because it's one thing to write a Troubles narrative like Louise Kennedy's Brilliant Trespasses or Michael McGee's Close to Home, which could be real. They feel very realist. It could be an incident that actually happened. What if you're using material about the Troubles and you're introducing sirens and ghosts and flying children? And is that disrespectful? Or does it give us somewhere to park our curiosity and to think through things in a safe space that is not, it's obviously not related to something that actually happened? So it serves a purpose that can't be done with realist fiction. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that all of that went into this story. That would be my process.
So in a certain way, you use a lot of magical realism.
Yeah.
You use it a little bit as a safe space.
Yeah, I think my brain works like that. So my brain works in metaphor much quicker than it does in realism. So I can kind of hone out the essence of what an issue is and put it into an extended metaphor and play with it there. I also just think it is much, much less potentially painful to talk about a fictional death. You can ask questions of it, you can query somebody's motives, you can do a lot of things that you really can't do if you're working with real material. I don't know if any of you had the adaptation yet of Say Nothing, Patrick Radden Keefe's novel, but it is working with a real story. It got a lot of criticism at home when it was adapted for the television in a way that I don't think Louise Kennedy's Trespasses is about to come out on TV. And it's very clear that it is a fictional story that didn't happen. There's space there to treat it as a piece of art and talk about it and be potentially disrespectful, that you can't when it's a piece of art that's about real people who really lost loved ones. So I'm often thinking about all of that.
That's really interesting. So could we hear a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm going to read you something a little bit less heavy. So I mentioned that I write a lot of short stories when I'm supposed to be writing novels, and this is one of them. When I was writing The Raptures, there's a lot of children in it, and this is not a spoiler, but they all die, except one. And I wanted to make sure that those dead children weren't just mechanical devices like what you get in crime fiction novels where the bodies, you never get their backstory. So I spent a lot of time writing a short story about each one of the children set 1 year before the book is set. And this is one of the stories. It is actually based on a real thing. So my lovely Nana, Gladys, she was the rep for a chicken company in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And she had to drive around in a little silver mini metro all over Northern Ireland trying to get shops to buy chicken fillets. And I used to go with her in my summer holidays in like 1984 and 1985. And I didn't realise why my job was to find telephone boxes. We had to keep phoning home to my grandfather. And I thought we were just being nice. But as an adult, I realised that we were making sure he knew we were still safe. That it wasn't the safest thing for a 65-year-old woman to be driving about the border in 1985 by herself. So I wrote this into the story. It is about a little girl called Ruth whose grandmother sells jam, and she's got a car, and it's a second-hand car, and when she buys the second-hand car, it comes complete with the ghost of the man who used to own the car. He lives in the back seat. And Ruth is a very Protestant sheltered child who's only just realising that there are Catholics out there. and that actually their ghost is a Catholic ghost. So this is where she discovers that. Alone at last with the backseat man, Ruth sets the library book aside and begins her interrogation. What's your name? Where do you come from? What's it like being dead? Have you been to heaven? Was it nice up there? Could you have a wee look about for my mummy? She got killed in a bomb a few years back. Angela Kelly is her name. All credit to him, his face softens a little hearing this. But does he answer Ruth's questions? He does not. He holds his silence like a riot shield, smoking one curt cigarette after the other while Ruth continues to pitch questions at him. It's only when she asks if the Sierra used to be his car that the backseat man finally opens his mouth. Jesus Christ, you've some nerve, wee lassie, he says. It's still my bloody car. Ruth notes the language, bad, and the accent, Newry, and understands they've been landed with the other sort of ghost. Later that week in the Sharkin, her suspicions are confirmed. Granny pulls in to let a combine harvester pass, and noticing they're outside the chapel, the backseat man crosses himself, spectacles, testicles, wallet and watch. Ruth's heard this off the wee lads in school. This is the first time she's seen anybody do it for real. There are no Catholics in her world. She's not a baby. She knows they exist. It was the Catholics who blew up her mummy, not for any particular reason, save being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ruth knows the difference between their law and hers. They fly a green, white and orange flag and paint your man with Jesus hair on their walls. Bobby, what's his name, that died? They have crosses on their church roofs and Mary in a box by the gate. Ruth's lot fly the Union Jack and have the Queen or Curly King Billy on their walls. They paint their curbs red, white and blue, a fresh lick of paint every year for the 12th. Ruth keeps track of the differences as they drive around, labelling the places in her head. Dunloy is Catholic, Cumber Protestant, Benton is Catholic, Hollywood's too posh to tell. Ruth worries about Granny going into certain shops. Wrong time, wrong place, and anything could happen. Surely Granny must know this more than most. When Ruth asks if it's sensible selling jam to Catholics, Granny tries to laugh it off. Jam's jam, she says. I'll be grand, my love. Nobody can tell which foot I kick with. A name like Kelly goes both ways. There are other things which go both ways, not football, obviously. If somebody's in a Celtic top, you can tell straight away they're not like you. The same goes for schools and where you live, also where you buy your groceries. Granny says that Stewart's is a Protestant outfit. Even the carrier bags are Loyal Orange. Crazy Prices is for the other lot. You can tell from the look of it, she says, the food is just flung at the shelves. Jam is not sectarian. It's equally popular with both sides, like dogs and shell suits, and that woman from here who won the Olympics and always gets asked to open things. Ruth is beginning to wonder if country music might be the same. Country and westerns all they listen to at home. They make the switch to country gospel on Sundays because Sundays is Jesus' day. Granny's a great one for John Denver. She's also partial to Tammy Wynette. She keeps an old shoe box of cassettes tucked beneath the passenger seat. It's Ruth's job to flip them over when the side runs out. Ruth's also expected to harmonise when Granny's in the mood for singing along. The backseat man is a country fan too. He nods along to Rhinestone Cowboy. He taps his finger on the back of the headrest while Tammy's winding her way through D-I-V-O-R-C-E. Ruth feels the vibrations like Morse code twitching at the back of her head. The next time Granny leaves them alone, the backseat man asks if there's any Chris Christopherson under the seat. It's the first time he's tried to start a chat, and even though Ruth's never heard of this Christoph man and is certain sure he's not in the shoebox, she tries to keep the conversation going. Do you like country music, she asks. Aye, the backseat man replies. So does Granny. I can see that, says the man. She's about to elaborate when Granny returns with an orange ice pot for Ruth and a tin of lilt for herself. Ruth is dying to ask the backseat man what he was doing listening to country and western. On the telly, Catholics only ever listen to twiddly-diddly music, fiddles and whistles and wee flat drums, the sort of music folks danced to in the olden days. Ruth always assumed that country's just for Protestants. She wonders if the backseat man got himself killed for listening to it. Stranger things have happened here. like this lad she knows from Young Farmers, he got beat up for walking past a Catholic pub in an orange t-shirt. Sometimes, when Grunda's watching the news, he'll mumble in a sad, sort of weary voice, "What is it, boys? They're killing each other over nothing these days."
That's very nice. So you brought up your own personal experience that influenced that short story. Are you usually aware of what you bring in your background that is influencing, or sometimes you realize afterwards?
I have a very strong line on this. Writers will often get asked, do you write about real life things that have actually happened to you? What the flip else are you going to write about? Like, I think writers create from the building blocks of their personal experience or what they have consumed. So literature, cinema, theatre, whatever they've been party to. It's impossible, like trying to make something up from nowhere is like trying to imagine a new colour. You're always working with what you already have inside you, and it might be approaching it through a kind of kaleidoscopic lens where it no longer looks anything like yourself, but it's always drawn on what you know. On the very most basic level, like when I write about love or loss or fear, all I have is my own personal experiences of times that I have been in love or been afraid, and you might be morphing that a little bit, but I can't imagine what it's like to pretend something I've never experienced myself. Now you get to dress that up in different ways. I'm not of the opinion that writers only get to write about their, that I could never write a male character, or I couldn't write a character from another country or something. That's the outfit you dress somebody up in. That understanding of those basic human feelings, emotions, experience, that's a universal kind of thing.
Interesting. Still talking a wee bit of experience, but changing a wee bit of subject. You have a collection of short stories that is dementia-inspired fiction. And funny enough, the title, A Little Unsteadily Into Light.
Oh, ask Julie what it is. Julie, do you know what it is?
Do you know what it is?
A Little Unsteadily Into Light.
No.
Stage directions from perhaps last week.
Oh.
I just out Beckett it, a Beckett scholar. Amazing.
Well, it's stage no. But it's really interesting how you bring this topic. And I understand you've worked with elderly people. You have even your grandmother had Alzheimer's as well. How did this topic come up to you? How do you try to portray it? How do you see it portrayed in literature as well?
And so I didn't actually write a collection of short stories. I have one short story, and I edited an anthology of newly commissioned work about dementia. So for 2 years I worked on a big research project at Queen's out of their linguistic department, which was looking at how dementia is depicted in contemporary fiction. So I read over 100 novels that have the dementia theme in them, some theatre as well, and some poetry too. And then we took some passages from some of those key texts and presented them to social workers, loved ones of people who have dementia, and people who have dementia themselves. So we thought it was important to have a working group of people who were living with dementia. And they drew up some suggestions, not guidelines by any means, but some suggestions for how to write ethically and well about dementia. Because dementia is a really interesting test case space for that issue of appropriation that fiction writers are often accused of. There's a spot at the end of someone's journey with dementia where they're physically incapable of telling their own story, and so if someone doesn't appropriate their story for them, those narratives are not going to exist. And so what we felt was if we could draw up some ethical guidelines for how you might approach this, it might help with other situations where people were writing into spaces that were not their own experience or something they'd lived through themselves. And it was a really incredibly eye-opening experience. Like as Jessica's just said, for 10 years previous to that I had worked in community arts with people who are living with dementia in a number of different arts projects. So I have a fair amount of knowledge, and 3 of my 4 grandparents have had different versions of dementia. My nana's the one I've written about the most because she had Alzheimer's for 8 years, but I've had a lot of personal experience of it. And I don't think that fiction has any job except to tell a story and tell it well. But if within that story you're talking about a subject and misrepresenting it in a way that can be harmful, I do think there's an ethical question there about stepping in. So I'll give you an example of this. Britt Bennett's novel, The Vanishing Half or the Other Half, The Vanishing Point. It's a large narrative stream about dementia in it, and in it she has the line, Alzheimer's is a hereditary illness. Alzheimer's isn't a hereditary disease. There is currently no medical scientific thing. Now that novel sold 500,000 copies. So imagine you're reading that and your mother has Alzheimer's. Suddenly you're getting into a panic. I'm going to get this too. And that is a case where we actually contacted the publisher and said that's factually inaccurate. So there are things there that I think you can hold writers accountable to without compromising their freedom to tell a good story. And then there are also moments, and this is just not my interpretation of it, but there's a lot of crapslash to it that really resonates with the dementia experience. And I find that super useful extended metaphor in a way that it's not calling itself a dementia narrative, but it allowed me to think about how language is used and how thinking and memory, and like Beckett is playing with it a lot in that space. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff came out of that project.
That's really interesting. There's also the radio monologue.
Yeah.
And I think that was actually interpreted by Liam Neeson.
Yeah. Liam's from Ballymena too, and he's been very supportive and really nice about my career, which has been lovely. I would like to be the second most famous person to ever come from Ballymena, and happy for them to be number 1.
I hope you're the second one, as the other one. So, would anyone like to make a question, or do you have any curiosity you'd like to?
I have many questions actually, so I wasn't going to end on them now because I just want to know everything. But I'll try to formulate something because I have a sensation about Irish writers and Northern Irish writers, which I don't know much. I just know like Beckett, Joyce, and some others from Ireland and Northern Ireland, which I've barely read. I'm just initiating your literature, but I think the sense of humor is something really it's a part of how people deal with life. And I know that probably, I don't mean that you were joking and making fun every day, but I think how the humor affects your narrative and how do you think you put it into your language, because I think you seem to be a very funny person as well, but you're also like writing about violence and trauma and testimony, so I think it will be interesting to know this.
Yeah, I mean, lots of Irish writers get asked this frequently about the balance between dark subject matter and humour and where it comes in. So probably don't be telling them this outside these walls, but my favourite contemporary Irish writer is Kevin Barry, and Kevin is an absolute master of balancing the dark subject matter with the humour. My set response to this is always, I think it comes down to hospitality, which is a weird thing to say, but I think one of the universal kind of character traits of Irish people is hospitality, and that can sometimes look like Irish mammies coming at you with the teapot and you must eat more sandwiches and you can't leave without some food to take home. Or it can be, you know, when you get in a lift with an Irish person and they must talk. You know, oh, the weather, oh, where are you going? We are very hospitable people. We like to put folks at ease and make sure they're happy. Now, if you translate that into, I'm going to tell you something terrible, so I'm going to tell you a story that has an awful piece of revelation in it, what is your next instinct is to make sure the person's okay, and humour is a really good way to do that. Now sometimes I think we use it too often, and there are spaces where the terrible thing needs to be left to resonate. So I get asked a lot about silencing around Northern Irish writing, and we have the saying that Heaney repeat it often, whatever you say nothing. This idea of not talking about difficult subject matter, that's a form of silencing. There's also a form of silencing that happens with the over-saying of something, when it becomes anecdotal and the power has gone out of it, and that can be done with humour, or it can be done with talking about something too often. So when I was doing more community arts projects, I did a log project on the Antrim Road with a group of women, of older women, who had all been living in a very working class neighbourhood that had felt the impact of the Troubles really heavily in the 70s and 80s. And one night they got into a conversation competing for who had been blown up the most times. And we got to 8. There was a woman in the group who had been physically blown up in a bomb 8 times. Now, I had to leave that conversation and go out and cry in the toilets. But you could tell from the way they were telling those stories in the language that they'd become dinner party anecdotes for them. They've just told it too many times, and it has lost the resonance of nobody should be blown up in a bomb 8 times. That's horrific. So there's a silencing that happens with using language in an over-familiar way. Does that make sense?
And I think maybe it resonates with the way that people approach to tragedy. They comprehend tragedy in their lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely better to talk about things than not talk about them. But how do we make a space where the words don't become overused? And maybe there's something in that related to why metaphor and fiction and creating a new kind of lens to see something becomes a place to kind of revive the language and do something a bit different.
Thank you so much. So much was so familiar when I was listening to you. Something I literally would be what most people in your neck of the woods would call soft southern nationalist. You were talking earlier about dairy girls and the way that's addressed some really awkward topics. What would be your blackboard? Where you get 2 groups together.
Oh, Robert, I have the best story about this.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'll explain. I was explaining to Jan that recently I was tidying my kitchen and I put my toaster on a shelf, but not behind closed doors. And if you haven't seen Dairy Girls, that means absolutely zero to you, but it's one of those. Oh yeah, that. So I know I grew up in a prosperous southern part of Dublin where we had very posh Presbyterian Methodist. And I know the voices of Church of Ireland, High Anglican in the south were reflected, but the voices of people of other Protestant traditions just weren't reflected. And certainly in the north, we weren't hearing those stories. There was no story about a particular political narrative.
I guess I'll say a kind of funnier thing, and then I'll say a slightly more serious one. So the blackboard in Dairy Girls is a big list of Protestants do this and Catholics do this. My blackboard moment was there was a thing in the north in the 70s and 80s called EMU, Education for Mutual Understanding. So our school system is segregated. It's still 91% segregated. I will say this statistic everywhere I go in the world because it's horrific. It costs us £600,000 a day to keep our kids segregated. And that just makes me sick every time I have to say it. But instead of actually integrating and mixing the schools in the 70s and 80s, they started EMU, Education for Mutual Understanding, which was, let's take those children maybe 2 times a year and send them on a school trip with some Catholics. Then they'll understand each other and it'll all be grand. And it didn't work. It was the biggest waste of time. I got sent on an overnight stay. I went to a Protestant girls' grammar school and we got sent on a residential 3-day kind of thing with some Catholic kids. And there was, at that stage, there was a thing called night lines, which are a bit like orienteering, but you had to follow a rope through a forest and kind of, so I got tied to a Catholic and left in a forest to find my way out. We were 15. It was supposed to help with the peace. I still, to this day, do not I'm not sure what that was doing for the pigs, but that was my kind of blackboard moment. I think on a more serious note, my big realisation has been of my own privilege. So I grew up in a middle class, nice Protestant home that was extremely sheltered. Ballymena, possibly because of its association with Paisley, possibly because it wasn't a big city, we actually got away reasonably easy in the Troubles. There were a couple of smallish bombs, but nothing like what Oma or Enniskillen went through. And John Hewitt, who's a poet of the same era as Amy, he has this poem called The Coasters, and The Coasters is about Protestant middle class people who went to garden centres and went on holidays as the Troubles happened. And that was my experience. I probably couldn't have told you when I was 12 that the Troubles was happening. Didn't know what it was because I was so sheltered. But a very good friend, Finn, who grew up in Ardoyne at the same time, she's exactly the same age as me, and she remembers as a 3-year-old being thrown over a wall to get away from open gunfire. And the moment that she told me that, I just went, shit, we went to garden centres. So part of me, when I come to places like this and I get asked about the Troubles, I feel like a bit of a fraud. It's something that I experienced secondhand. There are other complex things the way it impacted my family that I don't want to talk about yet, but I didn't lose a loved one, I never got caught up in a bomb. And so I think that is my toaster moment of going, I was super privileged, and it's not something that I hold lightly kind of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for your reading and for being, for presenting us your work. We were talking yesterday about the troubles and humor, and now I was thinking about Christina Reed's play, one of Jolly Riders, that was a girl. She was in a car accident. She was shot by the British Army, and then in the sequel she becomes a ghost, and she becomes she's a company for her friend who becomes a stand-up comedy girl. She goes to the stage with this ghost whispering the jokes to her. And also I remember David Ireland, Sadie, the play that was during the epidemics. Yeah. And he also puts a ghost inside a house that becomes somehow funny, but you know this line between terror and
Stuart Parker's Pentecost as well.
Yeah, and now tell me about your ghost.
How
is he sitting in the back of his car?
Yeah, I think ghosts are super interesting. I'm doing a panel in Belgium and Brussels next week on ghosts in literature. And I think the ghost is often used as a kind of Gothic device to inspire like horror, fear, negative stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I often quite like to invert the ghost. I don't want to ruin the story, but I'm going to tell you what happens at the end of that story anyway. So they're driving about in the car, and the ghost in the back seat is being very angsty all of the time. And then they are about to go down this road, and the ghost says to Ruth, "Don't go down that road. Make your granny stop now." And so she feigns that she's going to be sick, and they stop the car, and seconds later there's a bomb goes off at the end of the road. And so actually that ghost is a benevolent kind of, he's grumpy and he's not a particularly nice man, but he stops these two women in the car from driving into a booby trap bomb. And I like playing with ghosts like that. Like, who's to know what's around us? You know, we used to in Ireland have a really kind of healthy, liberal kind of attitude to, you know, that the temporal world maybe wasn't all that there was. In some ways we've lost that. When I was in Trinidad last year, I'm talking about ghosts again, and I always get asked to explain what my ghosts represent and symbolise. You don't get asked that in Trinidad. You get told things like, yeah, we've got a ghost in our kitchen. And it's a normalising of the paranormal that seems to have disappeared in Ireland. And I think there's something, I'm not an academic so anyone can write about this if they want, there's something linked to that around the lack of non-realist fiction. So in the last 50 years in Ireland,